Good morning. It is time for the sunrise report, and instead of being cute this morning with the sunrise in Alaska, I've been using that a lot lately, or some interesting part of the world, it is the exact time of the sunrise here in Ormond Beach, Florida. Now that doesn't mean you can see it over my shoulder, over there, because that's the time the sun comes over the horizon where nothing is in the way, as opposed to when it gets over the trees and the buildings over here. But if I talk long enough, we may be able to see at least a peek of it. Now, the headlines this morning, Deep State at it again via James Comey, who clearly was close with the Clintons and the whole machine there. And the New York Times doing their part to savage President Trump in this death by 1,000 cuts sort of way. Now it's about him potentially having had a conversation with the FBI Director James Comey about getting rid about Michael Flynn and asking them to back off the investigation. Now, I don't know. I don't have any specific evidence. But can you imagine the equivalent under Democrats? Can you imagine the things and 100 times more that went on like that under Barack Obama and Bill Clinton? That's all I'm going to say about the specific thing going on right there. But as is often the case, I'm going to bring something worth your attention to your attention here, and that thing is what Pat Buchanan just published. I think it was 2 days ago, and this talks about Nixon and Trump from the perspective of his time working for President Nixon in the 1970s. Now, keep in mind, Pat Buchanan, I like him. He's conservative. He's right about nationalism, in my opinion, protectionism, all that. But he seems to be mellowing out a little bit in his old age. I don't know, maybe he looks back fondly at some of the more left-wing rhino things that President Nixon did. As much as the left hated him, he did some things that were pretty not exactly conservative, and we have to keep that in mind. So I think it's important to, do I even have this up? You know, I'm going to have to ad-lib for a minute because I don't even have this up. You gotta bear with me here. Sorry, I was not fully prepared, I guess. But President Nixon, you know, the whole China thing, the gold standard, things are not, some of the departments he created. I'm gonna get into that, but let me just find this. No, oops, sorry about that. It is at Tacky Mag. Takimag, and it's also at Pat Buchanan's own website. I would recommend going to the Pat Buchanan website. I think I put it up there for you. Oh man, where is this? You know what? Hold on a minute. I did put it in there. This is the problem when you use two phones. Okay, here it is. Nixon and Trump, Then and Now by Patrick J. Buchanan. Here I was feeling so proud of myself because of getting this at the exact time of sunset, and it turns out I wasn't entirely ready. And a guy walked into the coffee shop, and he has a lot of strong opinions, so he can feel free to interrupt me at any point because I love hearing his opinions back there. But it looks like he's walking away right now because, man, I want to get Bill on here sometime. And here is the article by Patrick Buchanan called Nixon and Trump, Then and Now. Sorry to make you sit through all that ad-libbing, but you know what? We're very casual. I don't try to be polished. I just try to be honest and bring you stuff that's worth your time. For 2 years, this writer has been consumed by two subjects. This is Pat Buchanan again writing. First, the presidency of Richard Nixon, in whose White House I served from its first day to its last. Covered in my new book, Nixon's White House Wars, the battles that made and broke president and divided America forever. The second has been the astonishing campaign of Donald Trump in his first 100-plus days as president. In many ways, the two men could not be more different. Trump is a showman, a performer, a real estate deal maker, born to wealth, who revels in the material blessings his success has brought. Nixon, born to poverty, was studious, reserved, steeped in history, consumed with politics and policy, and among the most prepared men ever to assume the presidency. It doesn't mention it, but I find it interesting because of where I'm from in southeast Pennsylvania. Nixon also was Quaker, and I think that was part of his childhood, like the strictness involved there. His mom, I guess, was a pretty devoted Quaker, even though he grew up in California. Buchanan continues, yet the mess Trump inherited bears striking similarities to Nixon's world in 1969. Both took office in a nation deeply divided. Nixon was elected in a year marked by the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert Kennedy, race riots in 100 cities, and street battles between cops and radicals at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. By the fall of 1969, Nixon had buses surrounding the White House and U.S. airborne troops in the basement of his executive office building. Trump's campaign and presidency have also been marked by huge and hostile demonstrations. Both men had their elections challenged by the toxic charge that they colluded with foreign powers to influence the outcome. Nixon's aides were accused of conspiring with Saigon to torpedo Lyndon Johnson's Paris peace talks. Trump aides were charged with collusion with Vladimir Putin's Russia to disseminate stolen emails of the Democratic National Committee. The U.S. establishment, no stranger to the big lie, could not and cannot accept that the nation preferred these outsiders. Great point there by Buchanan. Nixon took office with 525,000 troops tied down in Vietnam. I didn't realize it was that many. Wow. Trump inherited Afghanistan, the longest war in U.S. history, and wars in Iraq, Syria, Libya, and Yemen. Nixon pledged to end the Vietnam War with honor and begin an era of negotiations, and did. Trump promised to keep us out of new Mideast wars and to reach an accommodation with Russia. Nixon and Trump both committed to remake the Supreme Court. Having pledged to select a Southerner, Nixon saw two of them, Judges Clement Haynsworth and Harold Carswell, savaged by the Senate. While Nixon was the first president since Zachary Taylor to take office without his parties having won either house of Congress, Trump took office with his party in control of both. Thus, Trump's nominee, Judge Neil Gorsuch, made it. Probably no two presidents have ever faced such hostility and hatred from the media. After his 1969 silent majority speech on Vietnam was trashed, Nixon declared war, authorizing an attack on the three networks by Vice President Spiro Agnew. Isn't this column really convincing, by the way? I just never really thought about these parallels before. Great work here by Pat Buchanan. He continues. Trump has not stopped bashing the media since he came down the escalator at Trump Tower to declare his candidacy. In Trump's first major victory on Capitol Hill, the House voted narrowly to repeal and replace Obamacare. Only with a tie-breaking vote by Agnew in August 1969 did Nixon win his first big victory, Senate approval of a strategic missile defense. Though Nixon had backed every civil rights law of the 1950s and 60s, he was charged with pursuing a racist Southern strategy to capture the South from Dixiecrats, whose ilk had ruled it for a century. Trump was also slandered for running a racist campaign. Trump and Nixon were supported by the same loyalists, forgotten Americans, middle Americans, blue-collar Democrats, and they were opposed and detested by the same enemy, a political, media, intellectual, cultural establishment. And this establishment is as determined to break and bring down Trump as it was to break and bring down Nixon. Yet, though Trump and Nixon ran up similar electoral college victories, Nixon at the end of 1969 was at 68% approval and only 19% disapproval. Trump, a third of the way through his first year, is underwater in Gallup. Nixon's achievements in his first term were extraordinary. Now, this is the part you probably want to take with a grain of salt because it's not exactly conservatism. He went to Beijing and opened up Mao Zedong's China to the world. Negotiated with Moscow the greatest arms limitation agreement since the Washington Naval Treaty of 1922, and withdrew all U.S. forces from South Vietnam. He desegregated the South, ended the draft, gave the vote to all 18-year-olds. That's not really such a good thing. Indexed Social Security against inflation, created the Environmental Protection Agency and the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, named 4 justices to the Supreme Court, presided over 6 moon landings, declared a war on cancer, proposed a guaranteed annual income, created revenue sharing with the states, took America off the gold standard, and let the dollar float. He then won a 49-state landslide in 1972, creating a new majority, and setting the stage for Republican control of the presidency for 16 of the next 20 years. But in June 1972, a bungled bugging at the DNC, which Nixon briefly sought to contain and then discussed as the White House tapes were rolling, gave his enemy the sword they needed to run him through. The same deep state enemies await a similar opening to do to Trump what they did to Nixon. Rely upon it. That's the end of it. Is it the end? I think it is. Yeah, now I got some good comments also that I selected last night that I think are really worthwhile here. Yeah, let me get them. Okay, this is in regard to the part about Nixon, born to poverty, was studious, reserved, steeped in history, and among the most prepared men ever to assume the presidency. And the commenter writes, I'm reminded of Goad's characterization, that's Jim Goad's characterization of Trump, as a, quote, huge, wet, sloppy, unapologetic fart in the face of all the madness of the Obama years, end quote. For all his faults, Nixon was at least erudite and a generally respectable person. With Trump, it's not always the easiest task to distinguish between rightful denigration of his buffoonery and witch hunting for his status as a straight white male. Another quote, another comment. I note that it's easy and fun and makes folks feel superior to dump on Trump. But I remain grateful that someone who could win took this on and kept us from a fate I don't think any of us can actually fathom. Only imagine what it would be like if it were President Hillary. Now here's a comment about this line from there. Nixon's achievements in his, I read this toward the end. It was the stuff about the war on cancer, took America off the gold standard, created the Environmental Protection Agency, etc. Here's what the person writes. Yeah, extraordinarily terrible. The response, that was, that they weren't extraordinary, they were extraordinarily terrible. The response is exactly my thoughts. He should have stayed the hell out of China. Nixon did end the draft and the war nobody understood, so I was grateful for that. Another response, bingo, pretty shocking to read Buchanan spinning that list into some sort of celebration. Another response, it gets worse as he gets older. Off the gold standard? EPA? Come on, Pat. Another response to that, at the time, there was a real threat of certain oligarchs cornering the gold market that motivated Nixon. And if you want to see what unfettered capitalism can do to an environment, go see China through the smog. Better bring your own air. Another comment on an unrelated part. This is a response to the end where it says, the same deep state enemies await a similar opening to do to Trump what they did to Nixon. Deep state enemies, precisely. John Ehrlichman's theory in his fascinating Washington novel, The Company. And the response to that is, or if you prefer nonfiction, there's Silent Coup by Len Kolodny and Robert Getlin, and that clears up the murky Watergate air. Another, instead of figuring out why they lost, Democrats keep insisting they didn't lose. As long as they continue doing this, they won't win again. Good. But of course, there's a response to that. They don't intend to win legally next time either, so the reason doesn't really figure into their calculations. What does figure is blaming the other side for her loss so that when they steal the next election, they can point to Republicans having previously, quote, stolen this one. Response to that, they want a special prosecutor to string this BS out at least till the next election cycle. They also want to see his tax returns, knowing there will be something in there to blow out of proportion. They are rubbish, have been for decades. Another comment. I never expected any miracles from Trump. The fact he won with all the scum and money he had against him is miracle enough. With all due respect to Pat, Nixon took us off the gold standard, gave us the EPA, OSHA, busing, put in price and wage controls, lingered in Southeast Asia far too long, put 3 pro-abortion judges on the Supreme Court who gave us Roe versus Wade, and finally went to China and kissed the ass of the worst murderers in history, Mao and Chu. I sure hope Trump does a lot better. Just a couple more left. Ronald Blake makes a good point in that Trump supports ICE's efforts to do their job. That is very true. And he appointed Sessions as AG, who is the best friend of controlling the effing border that the U.S. has ever had in that job. Ever. Reagan's DOJ gave you the biggest amnesty in the history of the U.S., and I don't even like to talk about the effing Bushes. I wish their act of love to be, that's a quote by Jeb, of course, I wish their act of love to be enacted upon their own rectums. Illegal immigration is actually down right now, and that is because of Trump. Contrary to the bull excrement in the liberal media, women and children are not walking across Mexico to come to the U.S. They're paying organized criminals to transport them to the U.S. border. You aren't going across Mexico without drug gangs transporting you at a cost of $10,000 to $20,000. It is an economic decision to immigrate. So you don't want to waste that kind of money if you think you were going to be caught and sent back because someone is actually enforcing the law. But please don't listen to the son-in-law, that's Jared, and his daughter, Ivanka, and enact DACA. That is Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, you know, the dreamers. And then he says, if that happens, then I will have a problem with Trump. Someone else, desegregating the South was no achievement. It was a colossal gift to the left as it gave them the wedge they needed to take over education, first in the South and then in the rest of the nation. The current crop of college-educated snowflakes is the fruit of that action. The entire nation is paying dearly for this stupidity. Last comment here, and there are a couple responses to this comment. If this is the sort of deal we can expect from a GOP which controls the House, Congress, and the presidency, then there's no reason to ever vote Republican again. And that is a quote from Ann Coulter regarding the no-wall budget. But there are responses to that. I can think of a reason. Hillary, or maybe Warren Chelsea, you know, Pocahontas, Geronimo Mao, Elizabeth Warren on a ticket with Chelsea Clinton. And then he writes again, Warren Chelsea, things could be much worse. And a response to that, having all the problems we have now, along with much gun control, would be much worse. Let's take a quick peek outside and see if I can show you a sunrise. I believe I can, but it's not going to be much. There it is. Let's go through the palm trees. This is your reward for sitting through that. Try to read the original, and there are plenty of more good comments on there. Let's get a peek. There you go.